So in this video, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle and the flow of carbon through an ecosystem. Now we know carbon is a major component of all organic molecules. So any molecule with carbon to hydrogen bonds in it will be considered organic. So things like carbohydrates, for example glucose, we know they've got carbon to hydrogen bonds in. We know proteins that are made of amino acids have carbon to hydrogen in. We know triglycerides, which are a type of lipid, also have carbon to hydrogen in. So these are all organic molecules. Now we know during the day plants take in carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere and they fix the carbon in the CO2 into glucose. So glucose is the end product of photosynthesis by plants, and we know that's an organic molecule. Now the plant cells, all of the plant cells, then take in the glucose and respire this glucose to release the energy in the form of ATP. Now all living organisms will take in glucose, normally originally made by the plants, and they can respire the glucose through cellular respiration, again to release the energy contained in the glucose. And this will release, if it's aerobic respiration, carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So respiration is a big process involved in the carbon cycle, as well as photosynthesis. So it's important to be able to draw out the equations for both photosynthesis and aerobic respiration to really start to understand the carbon cycle. So if you want to pause the video and have a quick go at this yourself, I'll just stop for a second. Okay, now if we think about photosynthesis, we know carbon dioxide gas is taken in from the atmosphere, and that's through the open stomatal pores during the day. And we know CO2 goes into the air chambers and it dissolves in the thin film of water that surrounds the mesophyll cells. That CO2 is then used in a process called the Calvin cycle, which is part of photosynthesis, and it's fixed into glucose. So we know carbon dioxide, the carbon here, will be fixed into glucose inside the mesophyll cells of the plant, normally in the leaf. Now we know the other raw material for photosynthesis is water, and we know the root systems of plants absorb water from the soil, and that goes across the cortex into the xylem. It goes up the stem through the xylem and into the leaves, where it's then used in photosynthesis. And if you've done the photosynthesis topic, you will know that water is required in a process called photolysis, but that's the photosynthesis topic. Now the original energy that will be used and converted to chemical energy wrapped up in the glucose molecule comes from the sun. So sunlight is the original form of energy that ends up in the chemical bonds within the glucose molecule. Now the other waste product, if you like, from photosynthesis is the release of molecular oxygen, and this actually comes from the process of photolysis. So we know carbon dioxide is fixed in photosynthesis, and we know oxygen is released from the process of photosynthesis from these plant cells. Now aerobic respiration is essentially the opposite of what we've just seen. So we know photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is fixed, water is needed, a little bit of energy from sunlight, glucose is produced, and oxygen is released. So in aerobic respiration, the glucose made from photosynthesis can be used by all plant cells and respired in the presence of oxygen. So we can put this down now. So glucose with its 6 carbons, it's a hexo sugar, carbohydrate, simple sugar. In the presence of oxygen, which is actually the final electron acceptor, which you will see in the respiration topic. So we can put a final electron acceptor, and that will produce carbon dioxide as a gas, so that's released back into the atmosphere. Water is another byproduct of aerobic respiration, and obviously the energy that was contained within the glucose to start with gets wrapped up in theoretically 38 ATP molecules, with the two terminal phosphate bonds being what we call the high energy bonds. And we know ATP is the universal energy currency inside cells it carries small packets of energy to where it's needed within the cell, maybe for an enzyme reaction or maybe for a carrier protein in a membrane for active transport. Now, the other equation that we're going to talk about is anaerobic respiration, and in particular in yeast. Now, under some conditions where there's a lack of oxygen in the environment, yeast cells will switch from aerobic respiration, which is this equation here, to what's called anaerobic respiration. And this is very useful when biofuels are going to be made where plant material has been used and it's been respired in the lack of oxygen by yeast to form what's called ethanol or alcohol. So in a lack of oxygen environment, yeast cells will take in glucose with their carbon. They will ferment the glucose through what we call alcoholic fermentation. Again, this is part of the respiration topic. And they will produce ethanol, which is an alcohol, again with carbon in that. Carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, and a small amount of ATP is made from alcoholic fermentation. So yeast can respire anaerobically when there's no oxygen present. They take in glucose, they break this down, it makes ethanol and it makes carbon dioxide. A small amount of ATP is made, which allows the cell to still survive and carry out its essential chemical reactions that require a little bit of energy. But obviously 2 ATP is a lot less than the 38 from aerobic respiration. Now ethanol can be collected and it can be used to make things like biodiesel, or it can be used as a biofuel when it's combusted to release energy. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. So we can now start to talk about the carbon cycle, and we know the two main processes are photosynthesis and respiration. So we know CO2 in the atmosphere is taken in by plants through the open stomatal pores into the leaves. We know it dissolves in the thin film of water that surrounds the mesophyll cells, and it diffuses into these mesophyll cells in the leaf. Now the carbon dioxide moves into the chloroplasts inside the mesophyll cells, and it's fixed to form glucose. So photosynthesis takes in a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and it gets converted into glucose inside the plant cells in the leaves. Now all of the cells of the plant, so not just the cells of the leaves, but the cells in the stem, in the root systems, etc., they respire the glucose to release the energy in the form of ATP. And that aerobic respiration releases a little bit of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So the plants take in a lot of carbon dioxide, they fix it into the form of glucose, so that reduces the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Some of the carbon dioxide released through respiration is actually used in photosynthesis itself, but some of it will be released back into the atmosphere. Now we know plants are eaten by lots of different types of animal, herbivores in particular, and the organic material in the plant gets consumed by these animals. Now we know cows, for example, are holozoic feeders, and we know they are heterotrophs, so we can put that here. Holozoic heterotrophs. Now that means that they can't make their own organic molecules. They can't synthesize them like plants can from photosynthesis, so they have to consume them ready-made in their diet. And holozoic means internal digestion, a specialized internal digestive system. So the cow, for example, eats the plant material. It will take in lots of organic material like proteins, amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates like cellulose, so we could put carbohydrates, and obviously glucose. Now inside the cow, the glucose will be distributed to all the cells of the cow, and the glucose will be respired to release the energy in the form of ATP. So we know the cow, for example, the herbivores, and any other animal that's going to eat the herbivore will release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as a consequence of cellular respiration. Now, some of the organic material that the cow, for example, eats will be converted into biomass. So it's used as material to build new cells, the lipids, phospholipid bilayers, proteins will form proteins inside cells like enzymes, etc. So a lot of the organic material is converted to biomass in the cow, but a lot of the glucose will be respired by all the cells of the cow to release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Now we know any living organism will eventually die, so we know the plants as well as the animals. So we're just going to circle this here. So plants as well as any animal, any living organism, they will die. And that dead organic matter becomes what's called detritus. Now it gets decomposed. So if you've got a dead plant or a dead cow, for example, over time it will be decomposed. And that's predominantly by microorganisms that we call saprophytes. So we can say saprophytes. Okay, so organisms like fungi and some types of bacteria. So dead organic matter is decomposed by saprophytes like fungus or different types of fungus and bacteria. That means they have extracellular digestion. They secrete enzymes onto the dead organic material. There's external digestion, and the fungus or the bacterium, it will then absorb some of the products of digestion. Now, sometimes dead organic matter, when it's decomposed, obviously these organisms, they are living organisms, the fungi and the bacteria, when they respire the glucose to release the energy in the form of ATP, that also releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So decomposition of dead organic material releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide gas. Now sometimes dead organic material, rather than be decomposed, it actually gets compressed in the sediments in the earth. Now that over many thousands of years becomes what's called fossil fuels. So under these conditions, decay can often quite be prevented. So the organic matter becomes compressed under very high temperatures and very high pressure into coal, oil or gas called fossil fuels. Now we know fossil fuels are extracted from the earth and they're used, for example, in power plants whereby they're combusted. And that releases a lot of the energy and it's converted to electrical energy, but also it releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So we can see here CO2 being released back into the atmosphere by combustion of fossil fuels like oil, gas and coal. Now another type of fuel is called a biofuel, and this is thought to be more environmentally friendly because, for example, if you take plant material, it can be fermented in the presence of yeast in the lack of oxygen, like we said on the previous slide. So plant material can be broken down and the sugars from the plant material can be fermented by yeast in a lack of oxygen, and that will produce ethanol, for example. And ethanol can then be combusted. It can be used as a fuel in cars, and that releases a smaller amount of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere compared to the burning of fossil fuels like oil or gas or coal. But the benefit of using biofuels is that if you replant the trees, they're going to take in the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's like a cycle whereby you plant trees to take in carbon dioxide, you convert the plant material into ethanol by alcoholic fermentation, and then you combust the ethanol to use as a fuel to release the energy, which releases the CO2 back into the atmosphere, which is then fixed once again. So we know the levels of carbon in the atmosphere have increased as a consequence of increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And this coincides with an increase in human population growth. So currently we're in the exponential period of growth for the human population. There's about 7.5 billion people on the planet. So human population number has increased. This is intricately linked with increased industrialization. So industry we know has increased, and this includes building of power plants whereby fossil fuels, for example, are combusted, and that releases the carbon as carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere and increases CO2 levels. We know that generates electricity, and we know the increase in human population requires an increased level of electricity, for example. So again, increased burning of fossil fuels to supply this increased human population number. Now, the two main reasons for increased CO2 in the atmosphere, one is, as we just mentioned, combustion of fossil fuels. So this includes coal, oil, and obviously natural gas. These are very carbon rich, and we know they're extracted from the earth because obviously dead plant and animal material over thousands of years has been highly compressed at very high pressures and high temperatures under the earth. And the carbon in those organisms becomes very concentrated. So when that carbon is combusted with oxygen, we know carbon dioxide eventually will be released into the atmosphere, which results in increased levels of CO2. And we know obviously electricity is generated from these processes. Now, the second main reason is deforestation. Now, we know plants and trees normally take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they fix the carbon in the form of glucose. So when you've got a dense, thick forest, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are going to be lower because that CO2 is being taken in through gas exchange into the trees and plants. However, when these trees are cut down, we know there's a lack of photosynthesis, so the CO2 remains in the atmosphere, resulting in the high levels that quite often are now being detected. So deforestation has a dramatic effect on carbon dioxide level. One of the other key ideas is agriculture. Now, we know agriculture involves deforestation quite often to make way for either cropland or cows, for example, which are grown for meat and obviously for the milk for dairy products. And we know cows release carbon into the atmosphere as methane or CH4, and we know methane is also a greenhouse gas. So if we look at all the different greenhouse gases, we've got carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, we've got nitrous oxide, and we've got methane. Now we know carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide, these are, for example, released back into the atmosphere through exhaust fumes from cars. We know methane, as we just said, is produced predominantly from cows, goes back into the atmosphere, and we know CO2 is from the burning of fossil fuels. So there's some of the main greenhouse gases that can accumulate in the atmosphere, and that can lead to what we know as global warming, and we'll see why very shortly. So this slide just shows us the levels of the different greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide, as we said, 57% is released into the atmosphere through the burning of the fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. We know carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can accumulate because of deforestation. So this carbon is not being taken into the plants because they've been cut down. So it starts to accumulate in the atmosphere. Now, two other ideas you need to know about deforestation then. The wood from the trees that are cut down when the forest is destroyed can often be used as a fuel, like a biofuel. And that burning of the wood from deforestation can also increase the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, any biomass that is left after deforestation, so maybe parts of the trees and the plants that are not utilized for wood, the root systems, for example, we know they're going to decompose or decay. So we've also got decomposer organisms like bacteria and fungi, and we know these will decay or decompose the dead organic plant material. And we know because these respire, they're also going to increase the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through decomposition. When these cells break down glucose in the presence of oxygen to make ATP, to allow the bacteria to divide and carry out their different enzyme reactions, but it does release the CO2 back into the atmosphere through decomposition. Now, the other gases that we did mention, nitrous oxide is about 8%. So we know nitrous oxide does come from vehicle exhaust fumes, and that can be a greenhouse gas. We also know methane is released from cows through agriculture. It's about 14% of the carbon in the atmosphere. And we know this is also linked with deforestation. So we could put this little line up here, because trees have to be cut down quite often to make way for farmland and for area to grow and graze cows on. One of the greenhouse gases, fluorinated gases in the atmosphere, and historically these are chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and they were once used as aerosol propellants, as well as the coolants that we would find in fridges and freezers. Now, CFCs have actually been banned because they did start to deplete the ozone layer, but quite often in the coolants and aerosol propellants, we do still find what are called hydrochlorinated fluorocarbons. So HCFCs, hydrochlorinated fluorocarbons, and these can pose somewhat of a problem in terms of greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere. So we know the accumulation of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, put these in here, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and fluorinated hydrocarbons. They can lead to increased atmospheric temperatures, and the reason is we know the sun emits radiation, solar radiation. Some of this will be reflected by the ozone layer and the atmosphere back into space. Some of the solar radiation does penetrate the ozone layer and the atmosphere, and it does reach the Earth's surface. Some of this energy is absorbed by the Earth's surface, which maintains a certain temperature, and some of the energy will be emitted as infrared radiation away from the Earth's surface. Now, if there's an accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, such as methane and carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, these infrared radiation, this infrared radiation can actually be reflected back towards the Earth's surface instead of being emitted out into space, and this enhances the increase in temperature at the Earth's surface, and it has several knock-on consequences, and that's going to be ideas like the polar ice caps and glaciers we're going to see start to melt somewhat. There's going to be a rise in sea levels, for example, and we'll talk about these on the next slide. So we know there's an accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as a consequence of activities like deforestation, etc. Now, we know this can have a knock-on effect, and it does contribute to global warming, which is an increase in the average temperature of the Earth's surface each year. Now, some of the ideas that we need to think about, well, melting of the polar ice caps, now that can actually destroy habitats. So we know polar bears, for example, require the ice as their habitat to form shelters, to hunt from, etc. And these habitats are being destroyed. This does result in an increase in the average sea level, which can also destroy coastal habitats. We know climate change has brought about extreme weather conditions such as droughts, hurricanes, cyclones, etc., which also can have a devastating effect on local habitats. The increased temperature can also contribute to the increased frequency of forest fires, for example, which we can see here from this picture is going to devastate many forest habitats, as well as killing off many different types of animals and plants, and therefore it's going to reduce biodiversity. And it also is going to further increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well. Now, we know plants and animals may be driven to extinction if they cannot find a suitable habitat fast enough. So we know natural selection would normally kick in. We know individuals with beneficial characteristics might be able to survive if they can move away from this area of devastation quick enough and find a suitable habitat to which they can adapt to. Because we know the deforestation, for example, is a selection pressure. But if these animals cannot move to a suitable environment quickly enough, if there aren't any individuals with adaptations that would allow them to do this, they're going to be selected against, and therefore that's going to put them at risk of extinction, where there's so few numbers of a particular species left that it's unlikely they'll be able to survive in the long term. Now, we also know, this last picture, there's been a decrease in pH of the oceans, and that has led to many aquatic organisms being adversely affected, in particular coral ecosystems. So we know coral ecosystems are made of many different types of species with a very, very high biodiversity. But what we've seen recently is the very biodiverse coral ecosystem has undergone this bleaching effect. So this picture on the right hand side, we can see all the colours gone, all of the organisms have died off, and that's because these ecosystems, the organisms within them, are very sensitive to pH changes. So if we've got an increased CO2 content in the atmosphere, we know CO2 dissolves somewhat in water, and that produces H2CO3, so this in black, H2CO3, that's carbonic acid. So we get increased hydrogen ions in the water, which lowers the pH, makes it more acidic, and adversely affects these organisms. So increased CO2 in the atmosphere, the CO2 can dissolve in the oceans, and it can form carbonic acid, which releases H+ ions and lowers the pH. So we know in order to generate electricity from a power plant, it's very often that fossil fuels are being combusted, things like coal, oil and gas, which are non-renewable sources of energy extracted from the earth. Now, one possible solution is the use of biofuels. So these are fuels that can be combusted, for example, to release energy that can be used to generate, for example, electrical energy. And the source of the fuel is biological in origin. So, for example, we know wood can be burnt, and that releases a large amount of energy, but we know wood comes from trees. Now, a process called coppicing is one way of generating wood as a biofuel, because we know if you've got a certain species of tree, what can happen? We know in the soil is a root system, and coppicing is where the tree is chopped near to its base, but the root system is left in the soil. So that tree can regrow over the course of, say, 9 or 10 years, and then the cycle keeps repeating itself. So the trees are not being destroyed, they're just being cut down very close to the ground. The root system is kept in place. The stump of the tree can then continue to grow. So after a short space of time, we've still got the root system in the soil, and then we get these kind of vertical stems that grow up from the stump of the tree that was left, and these can then be removed for wood as a biofuel. Bioethanol is another biofuel that is quite common these days. Now, we know, if we go back to the first slide, anaerobic respiration can take place inside certain microorganisms like yeast. Now, we call yeast facultative anaerobes. I'm going to put this in facultative anaerobes, and that means that these yeast cells, type of fungus, they will respire aerobically in the presence of oxygen. So they'll absorb glucose from their environment, and they'll break the glucose down in the presence of oxygen to release the energy as ATP inside the cell. But when the oxygen is not present, yeast cells can still break down glucose that they absorb, but the end product in this case is ethanol and a little bit of carbon dioxide. And this ethanol can be extracted, and then it can be used as a biofuel. Now this might be preferential to use of a fossil fuel, because when you combust the ethanol or the fuel made from the ethanol, it releases a less or a lower amount of CO2 into the atmosphere compared with the carbon-rich fossil fuels. Now the other benefit of using biofuels, where we actually take plant material and we extract the sugars from the plant material, which get fermented by the yeast cells. So we're going to use the plant sugars as a respiratory substrate for respiration in yeast, anaerobic respiration, is we can actually replant the trees. So it's a cyclical process. So we chop trees down, and we're going to use the plant sugars from the trees. We're then going to replant the trees, and we know they're going to take in some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps keep it relatively low in the atmosphere. Now biodiesel, as we're going to see in a minute, these can be used as a cleaner source of fuel, for example cars, jeeps, lorries, etc. And they're going to use the respiratory substrates from plant material like sugarcane, rapeseed or corn. Now one of the newer ways of making a biodiesel is actually to use algae, and we can grow algae on a relatively large scale, and we're going to use these. We're going to extract the lipids from the algae, and they're going to be used to make the biodiesel. And we know lipids are very carbon rich, so they're going to make a very good fuel. Biogas can involve methane as well, and we can use methane to form different fuels that can then be combusted to release some energy. So these are 4 different ways of having a biofuel that might be more economically and environmentally friendly. So we can now start to talk about bioethanol in a little bit more detail. And we know bio means biological in origin, and the starting material will be plant-based material, and that can be sugarcane, it could be wheat, corn. Irrespective of the type of plant material, we know they all contain starch, because starch is a storage polysaccharide that we find within these different plants, and it stores chemical energy in the carbon to hydrogen bonds of the complex carbohydrates. So we know starch is made from 2 different types of polysaccharide: amylose, which is helical, which forms the core of the starch grains, and amylopectin, which is branched on the outside of the starch grains. So the starch, for example, is removed from the plant material, and that's then hydrolyzed into its constituent monomers. So alpha glucose is released from the breakdown of starch. The glucose is then used as a respiratory substrate for yeast cells. So the yeast cells are going to respire the glucose in a lack of oxygen because they're facultative anaerobes. So this is called anaerobic respiration. These cells are going to make a little bit of ATP, but they're also going to have 2 end products: ethanol, so C2H5OH, ethanol, and a little bit of carbon dioxide. Now the ethanol can be extracted and purified, and then it's used to make a gasoline mix, which can be put in your car, for example, and combusted to release energy that drives the car. Now if we have a look at the cycle below, to this picture down here, this uses corn as a starting plant material, whereby the corn's finely ground down. The sugars are isolated, so things like alpha glucose or fructose, for example, and these sugars are used in alcoholic fermentation by yeast cells The ethanol is then distilled and separated and used to make the gasoline. We know the car will release some CO2 into the atmosphere, so it does still release the carbon dioxide. However, the plant material that is harvested to make the ethanol, these plants are regrown, they're replanted, therefore they do take in the carbon dioxide that is released as a consequence of burning the ethanol and combusting the ethanol in the car to release the CO2. So it's a cyclical process. So it's important that the crops are replanted so that these do take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to be used in photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is what takes in the carbon dioxide with a little bit of water from the soil, taken in through the roots, and that does make glucose, and obviously releases oxygen. So it's this glucose that is used to make things like cellulose, or it's stored as starch, and the cycle then continues. Now, one other recent advancement in biofuels is the use of algae as the starting material to provide the biomass. So we know algae can be grown on quite a large scale, and they do photosynthesize. So we can see here on the left, a little bit of sunlight is the light energy, carbon dioxide is the carbon that will be used to make glucose, and we know water is needed for photosynthesis. So the algae do produce glucose from this process. Now the algae can then be isolated, and number two here, they get put through a press. Now these algae, they do contain a lot of oil, so the algae will use the glucose they make from photosynthesis, and from the glucose make fatty acids and glycerol to be able to make triglycerides. So a large component of the algae cells is actually lipids or triglycerides, and these oils or triglycerides can be extracted when the algae are put through this press. So the end product here that's being extracted from the algae is the oil, or we could say triglycerides, and the oil is then separated from the sugars and other molecules by being added to a solvent. So this might be an organic solvent, for example. We know lipids dissolve in organic solvents. The solvents then evaporate off, which will leave the lipids, the triglycerides. They can then be used directly to make a fuel that, for example, could be used in a car engine. It's quite a refined type of fuel. Now, if we have a look at the data at the bottom of this slide, we can see that algae, they are organisms and they do photosynthesize and do respire, but they're non-toxic, which is very much a benefit when they're being used to make a biofuel. They're also highly biodegradable, so they're not going to contaminate the environment in any way. Now, algae tend to be used because they have this very high lipid content. So other types of plant material can be used to make biodiesels, for example, castor oil, coconut oil, or palm oil. But it just so happens that the algae, because of their very high lipid content, are very good, a good source of starting material to make your biofuel or biodiesel. Now, one definition we need to be able to learn is that of the carbon footprint, and this is the total amount of carbon put back into the atmosphere by the actions of either an individual, a product, a service, or an organization over a period of 1 year. So if we talked about the carbon footprint of an individual, for example, it might be that they drive a car, and we know this might release carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through exhaust fumes. We know they might eat meat, so a lot of meat comes from cows, and there might be deforestation to make room for the grazing of the cows on farmland, so that might reduce the amount of CO2 taken in from the atmosphere. We know also that individuals might use electricity, which might come from the burning of fossil fuels. which we know increases CO2 into the atmosphere, etc. So all the activities of this individual, how much carbon, as predominantly carbon dioxide, gets put back into the atmosphere. Now, there is a website called carbonfootprint.com, and if you want to check your carbon footprint, you can go here and have a quick look at that. So what are the issues that we could look at in terms of reducing our carbon footprints? Well, we could possibly use recycling of materials used to package food, for example. So we could start to recycle our cardboard and our paper. So paper and cardboard can always be recycled and reused, because we know that comes from the cutting down of plant material and trees to make the paper. We could obviously drive less, because the less we drive, the less carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide we put back into the atmosphere. We could take public transport, and while that does obviously put some carbon back into the atmosphere, collectively, if more people did that, it would be less. We could use less air conditioning, we could use less heating in our homes, we could insulate our homes better so that we had to use less electricity, which might mean less fossil fuels are burnt collectively if more people did this. We could change our diet somewhat to reduce the amount of animal protein that we consume. Maybe meat, for example. If there's less meat in our diets, then less cows need to be killed, and therefore less methane would go back into the atmosphere. We could avoid food waste. So, for example, we could turn our any food waste into compost that we could then use to grow plants and trees, and that might allow the actual planting of more trees, which we know takes in CO2 from the atmosphere and fixes that in the form of glucose. So there's a number of different activities that we could think about in terms of reducing our carbon footprint and the amount of carbon we put back into the atmosphere over the course of 1 year. So we can start to have a look at some exam questions and use the knowledge that we have of the carbon cycle to help us with our answers. Now, it's always a good idea to read through the questions first before you actually start writing anything. So we'll read through A, B, and C first. We'll then start to think about what answers we might want to put down. And then once we've actually got the answers in our head, we could actually make some little notes in the margin if we wish, and then you can write out the answers. It's worthwhile trying to get maybe 1 extra point for each question. So for example, question A, what is a fossil fuel? We might want to think of 3 possible key ideas, so we make sure we hit all those marks. So let's have a look at the first question. What is a fossil fuel? Well, we know a fossil fuel is any plant or animal material that was once living, that has died, that's been compressed under high pressure and high temperatures under the earth. We know they're very, very carbon rich, and when they're extracted from the earth, they're going to be used as a fuel, for example, oil, coal, or gas. So it's always a good idea to put some nice examples in there as well, because they're quite often going to pick up a mark. So here's the actual answer then, the mark scheme. So fuels derived from biomass that were once living, created by the conversion of plant or animal matter over millions of years, under high pressure and high temperatures under the earth, high or very rich source of carbon, therefore lots and lots of stored chemical energy, and the examples are given here. So we could pick up 2 marks there. Now, the next question, B, says, why has the use of fossil fuels increased over the last 50 years? So we need to think about what this, the burning of the fossil fuels, the energy that's released, what's that being used for? So we know, for example, there's an increase in the number of cars on the roads, especially in the last probably 10 or 15 years. And we know they're fueled by petrol, which is a fossil fuel. We also know there's much more industry. Now, power plants, for example, we know burn fossil fuels. That's going to convert a lot of the energy released into electrical energy that is used to power industry, to supply electricity to people's homes, for example. And that might be to heat the home. Now, the third question says, in Brazil, petrol stations sell a type of fuel which is made of 80% unleaded petroleum spirit and 20% ethanol. Describe two of the benefits of using ethanol as a biofuel. So we know ethanol is produced by anaerobic respiration in yeast. It's a byproduct of respiration in these yeast and a lack of oxygen. So let's have a look at the answers. Well, we know the sugar originates from sugarcane or some sort of plant material, and we know sugar is the starting molecule for respiration inside the yeast cells. So here they've talked about the sugarcane being milled, being ground up. It produces sugarcane juice, which contains lots of sugars, glucose. That sugar is then fermented using yeast, which produces ethanol as a waste product. We know ethanol, when it's combusted, it's what's called a clean burning fuel. That means it has no toxins. So it doesn't have, for example, sulfur, which would be a toxin released into the atmosphere from fossil fuels, for example. There's no sulfur. It's a clean burning, clean combusting fuel. So there's less pollution into the atmosphere, less CO2 is returned to the atmosphere. Also, the ethanol can be produced through this process close to where it's actually going to be used. So less transportation results in less CO2 being released back into the atmosphere through the use of fuel for vehicles to transport the ethanol to where it's going to be needed. Now, it's also called carbon neutral, and that's because even though it does put out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when it's combusted and burnt, if you replant the trees or the plants like the sugarcane, we know they're going to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to make glucose. That's going to be used for growth. So the starting raw material that's used to make the biofuel, the ethanol, which is, for example, the sugarcane or the plant, as long as you replant them and regrow them, they're going to take in some of the carbon dioxide that's actually released as a consequence of burning the fuel. So because it is carbon neutral, it has a much smaller, if any, effect on global warming, because there's less of that greenhouse gas CO2 being released or accumulating in the environment. So we could list several of those and we could get our 4 marks.